The morning sun over Derna airfield in Libya cast long shadows across what appeared to be a formidable display of British air power. Rows of bombers sat motionless on the tarmac, their wings gleaming in the harsh North African light. To the Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot circling at 15,000 feet on October 23, 1942, they represented a significant threat. Dozens of aircraft that could strike General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's supply lines stretching back to Tripoli. He noted their positions carefully, banking his Messerschmitt Bf 110 toward home to report what he'd seen. Within hours, Junkers Ju 88s would roar eastward, their bomb bays loaded with high explosives destined for those seemingly vital targets. The attack would be meticulously planned, executed with the precision that had made the Luftwaffe feared across 3 continents, and it would be, in the most profound sense, a complete waste. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What that German pilot couldn't know, what Rommel's entire intelligence apparatus failed to grasp, was that those bombers were constructed of plywood, canvas, and empty oil drums. They couldn't fly. They couldn't fight. They were elaborate theatrical props in what would become one of the most successful deception operations in military history, a campaign that would help turn the tide of the North African War and expose a critical vulnerability in German operational thinking. This is the story of how the British convinced Rommel to waste his dwindling resources bombing shadows, and what the Desert Fox said when he finally understood the scale of the deception that had been played against him. The Western Desert in October 1942 was a landscape defined by scarcity. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every spare part had to be shipped across the Mediterranean, under constant threat from British submarines and aircraft operating from Malta. For Rommel's Panzer Army Africa, strung out along a defensive line stretching from the Mediterranean coast at El Alamein southward into the Qattara Depression, logistics determined everything. The General Feldmarschall understood better than most that modern warfare was fundamentally an equation of supply, not courage, not tactical brilliance, but the simple arithmetic of who could deliver more men and materiel to the point of decision. This understanding made air superiority critical. The Luftwaffe units supporting Rommel, primarily Fliegerkorps X and elements of Fliegerführer Afrika, operated under constant strain. Fuel shortages limited sortie rates. Spare parts arrived irregularly. Pilot fatigue accumulated over months of continuous operations. Every mission had to count. Intelligence officers scrutinized reconnaissance photographs with desperate attention, searching for targets that would yield maximum impact for minimum expenditure. Enemy airfields topped the priority list. Destroy aircraft on the ground, the doctrine held, and you multiply the effect of every bomb. Not merely eliminating that single plane, but removing all the sorties it might have flown, all the damage it might have inflicted. The British understood this calculation perfectly. In the summer of 1942, as General Bernard Montgomery assumed command of the 8th Army and began planning what would become the Second Battle of El Alamein, the challenge was clear: how to concentrate sufficient force for a breakthrough without revealing the point of attack. How to prevent Rommel from detecting the massive buildup of men, tanks, artillery, and supplies necessary for a major offensive. The answer would involve an unprecedented campaign of tactical deception, codenamed Operation Bertram, that would manipulate German expectations at every level. At the heart of Bertram lay a simple insight about human perception. People see what they expect to see. German intelligence officers, scanning reconnaissance photographs and analyzing reports from agents, operated within a framework of assumptions about British capabilities and intentions. They expected logistical buildup to follow predictable patterns. They expected new units to appear in staging areas before moving forward. They expected dummy positions to be crude and easily identifiable. The British plan was to meet those expectations and then systematically invert reality. The deception operation began with real engineering challenges. Creating convincing dummy equipment wasn't simply a matter of painting canvas. It required understanding exactly what German reconnaissance cameras would capture from various altitudes and angles. It meant replicating shadows, matching weathering patterns, mimicking the tracks vehicles would leave in sand. British camouflage officers studied captured German reconnaissance photographs to understand what details the enemy analyzed, what features they used to distinguish real equipment from fakes. Major Jeffrey Barkas, who commanded the Middle East Camouflage Directorate, had worked in film production before the war. He brought a cinematographer's understanding of how light, shadow, and perspective create illusion. His team included set designers, artists, and engineers who approached the problem methodically. A dummy tank needed to cast the right shadow at different times of day. It needed to show the same heat signature in infrared photography. It needed to look slightly weathered. Too pristine suggested fakery, but not abandoned. The details mattered because German photo interpreters were trained professionals who knew what to look for. The dummy aircraft that would waste so much Luftwaffe ordnance were masterpieces of improvised engineering. Construction began with wooden frames that matched the basic dimensions of Wellington bombers or Hurricane fighters. Canvas, stretched over these frames, replicated the aircraft's profile. Oil drums provided volume for fuselages. The key was verisimilitude at reconnaissance altitude, typically 15 to 20,000 feet, where cameras couldn't capture fine detail but could register shape, shadow, and spacing. Ground crews positioned these false aircraft in dispersal patterns that matched actual RAF practice, spacing them as real planes would be spaced to minimize damage from a single bomb. But the truly sophisticated element of the deception wasn't the dummy aircraft themselves. It was the entire false narrative they supported. Fake airfields weren't simply scattered randomly across the desert. They were positioned where genuine forward airstrips might logically be located based on operational range, supply line access, and tactical need. Each false installation told a story: a squadron rotating forward, reinforcements arriving from Egypt, strike capabilities expanding in a particular sector. German intelligence officers, analyzing these positions, would conclude that British air strength was concentrated in areas where it posed minimal threat to the actual offensive's axis of advance. Simultaneously, real British aircraft were being hidden or disguised. At genuine forward airfields, where fighters and bombers prepared for the coming offensive, camouflage netting and careful positioning made them invisible to aerial reconnaissance. Some real aircraft were disguised as trucks using specially designed covers. Others were dispersed into areas the Germans had already photographed and catalogued as containing only supply vehicles. The principle was misdirection on an industrial scale. Show the enemy a convincing lie in one location while hiding the truth in another. The Luftwaffe took the bait systematically. Throughout late September and early October 1942, German bombers struck repeatedly at the dummy installations. Attack reports dutifully recorded aircraft destroyed, runways cratered, fuel dumps ignited. Intelligence summaries noted with satisfaction the degradation of British air capabilities in specific sectors. Operational planners reviewing these assessments concluded that air superiority over certain portions of the front had been achieved or was imminent. Each successful raid against dummy targets represented multiple failures of German intelligence methodology. Photo interpreters were seeing what they expected rather than examining images with sufficient skepticism. Human intelligence networks, already compromised by British counterintelligence operations, provided reports that seemed to confirm the photographic evidence. Signals intelligence offered no contradictory information because British radio operators maintained normal traffic patterns around the false installations, chattering about weather conditions, maintenance schedules, and operational readiness exactly as they would at real bases. The psychological dimension of the deception was particularly insidious. Luftwaffe crews, returning from attacks on dummy airfields, reported the characteristic signatures of successful strikes: secondary explosions, fires, debris patterns. These reports reinforced the illusion at every level. Ground crews preparing aircraft for the next mission believed they were hitting real targets. Intelligence officers processing bomb damage assessments saw confirmation of their earlier conclusions. Commanders planning operations made decisions based on a fundamentally false picture of the battlefield. Rommel himself was not directly involved in target selection for individual Luftwaffe raids that fell to General Major Otto Hoffmann von Waldau and his staff. But the General Field Marshal relied absolutely on the intelligence picture they presented. His defensive dispositions, his allocation of limited reserves, his assessment of where Montgomery might attack, all depended on accurate understanding of British strength and dispositions. If German intelligence believed British air power was concentrated in the north, Rommel would expect the main attack there. If reconnaissance suggested major supply dumps in the southern sector, he would position his mobile reserves accordingly. The true scope of Operation Bertram extended far beyond dummy aircraft. False supply dumps appeared in areas where the British wanted Germans to expect logistical buildup. Dummy tanks, hundreds of them, materialized in sectors where no offensive was planned. Real tanks, meanwhile, were disguised as trucks using a system called sunshields, lightweight frames that transformed the distinctive profile of a Sherman or Grant into something resembling a common supply vehicle. At night, these tanks moved forward into actual attack positions. During daylight hours, when German reconnaissance aircraft flew, they remained hidden beneath their truck disguises while dummy tanks appeared in the positions they'd vacated. The deception created an entirely fictional British order of battle. German intelligence maps showed force concentrations that didn't exist, supply lines supporting phantom divisions, airfields hosting imaginary squadrons. More critically, the deception concealed the real concentration occurring in the north, where Montgomery was massing the armor and artillery for his main thrust. While Luftwaffe bombers wasted ordnance on plywood aircraft, real British fighters and bombers prepared for the air campaign that would support the ground offensive. The scope of resources devoted to this elaborate theatrical production is staggering in retrospect. Approximately 700 dummy tanks were constructed. Thousands of dummy vehicles populated false supply areas. Entire false railroad installations appeared in the southern sector, complete with dummy rolling stock and locomotive sheds. The camouflage units created a fictional army complete in every detail that German reconnaissance could verify, while simultaneously hiding the real army massing for attack. What made the deception particularly effective was its foundation in genuine British operational culture. The dummy installations didn't appear overnight. That would have suggested artificiality. Instead, they developed gradually, exactly as real installations would develop. A reconnaissance flight on September 15th might show initial grading at a future airfield site. A week later, photographs would reveal the beginnings of runway construction. By October 1st, aircraft would appear. First a few, then more, following the pattern of a squadron deploying forward. This gradual development matched German expectations about how the British operated, making it psychologically credible. The Luftwaffe's own operational constraints made them more vulnerable to the deception. Fuel shortages meant reconnaissance flights couldn't cover all areas with equal frequency. Photo interpreters had to prioritize which negatives to examine in detail and which to review quickly. Intelligence officers faced enormous pressure to provide actionable assessments, identifying real threats, distinguishing significant developments from routine activity. Under these pressures, confirmation bias became endemic. If evidence suggested British forces were concentrating where German doctrine predicted they should concentrate, that evidence was readily accepted. Contradictory indications were explained away or attributed to minor tactical adjustments. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The weather itself became part of the deception. Desert sandstorms, which could ground aircraft and obliterate tracks within hours, were timed into the British plan. After storms passed, German reconnaissance would find the dummy installation still present, battered perhaps, but surviving exactly as real installations would survive. This persistence reinforced the illusion's credibility. Temporary installations would have blown away. Only substantial real facilities would endure. British operational security extended beyond the physical deception to include elaborate communications security. Radio operators at dummy installations maintained realistic traffic patterns, transmitting encoded messages that German signals intelligence could intercept but not decipher. The volume and frequency of transmissions matched what would be expected from real units. Call signs rotated according to standard procedures. The entire electromagnetic signature of the false positions mimicked reality. Human intelligence added another layer to the deception. British counterintelligence services, particularly the A-Force, commanded by Colonel Dudley Clark, had identified and turned many German agents operating in Egypt. These double agents fed carefully crafted misinformation to their German handlers, reporting troop movements that confirmed the photographic deception. A turned agent might report seeing tank transporters moving south, exactly what German intelligence would expect if the British were concentrating forces for an attack in the southern sector, exactly what reconnaissance photographs of dummy tanks would appear to confirm. The deception's success depended on multiple intelligence channels telling the same false story. Photography showed dummy tanks in the south. Radio intercepts suggested unit movements to that sector. Human intelligence reported supply convoys heading that direction. German analysis, confronting this convergent evidence from independent sources, concluded, reasonably but incorrectly, that the intelligence picture was accurate. The possibility that all channels had been compromised or manipulated simultaneously seemed too paranoid to credit. Rommel, reviewing intelligence summaries in his headquarters at Tel El Asa, saw a picture that appeared to make tactical sense. British forces were building up strength. Supplies were accumulating. But the main concentration seemed to be developing in the south, where terrain favored mobile operations. Exactly where German doctrine suggested the British should attack if they intended a war of maneuver rather than attritional breakthrough. The northern sector showed activity, but nothing suggesting the massive concentration that would be required for Montgomery's actual plan. A methodical infantry breakthrough in the north, creating a corridor through which armor could exploit. The General Field Marshal had learned to respect British capabilities over 18 months of desert warfare. He'd seen their industrial capacity overwhelm German tactical excellence at Crusader. He understood that Montgomery commanded resources, particularly artillery and air support, that exceeded anything the Panzer Army Africa could muster. But Rommel's respect for British material strength made him more, not less, vulnerable to Bertram's deception. He expected them to leverage their superiority through conventional means, mass, concentration, overwhelming firepower applied at the point of decision. Operation Bertram showed him exactly that, in completely the wrong location. The Luftwaffe continued striking dummy targets through mid-October. Mission reports accumulated, describing successful attacks on British airfields, supply dumps, and tank parks. The aggregate expenditure of bombs, aviation fuel, and pilot hours was enormous. Each sortie against a dummy target was a sortie not flown against a real one. Each bomb wasted on plywood was a bomb unavailable when the actual offensive began. The cumulative effect was strategic. It degraded German air capabilities not through attrition in combat, but through misdirection in targeting. On the night of October 23, 1942, Montgomery launched Operation Lightfoot, the opening phase of the Second Battle of El Alamein. Nearly 1,000 guns opened fire simultaneously in a barrage that lasted 5.5 hours. Infantry from 4 divisions attacked on a front stretching roughly 9 miles, driving into the German-Italian defensive positions. In the skies above, the RAF flew over 125 sorties that first night, having suffered none of the attrition German intelligence believed they'd inflicted. The attack's location and weight came as a profound shock to German command. The main assault fell not in the south, where dummy tanks had drawn their attention, but in the north, where real armor had been positioned beneath sunshield disguises. The air umbrella the British enjoyed, continuous fighter cover, ground attack aircraft supporting the advance, bombers striking German positions, revealed capabilities that supposedly had been degraded by weeks of successful Luftwaffe raids. Within hours, German intelligence officers were desperately trying to reconcile their assessments with the reality unfolding. Rommel, who had been in Austria on medical leave, received news of the attack early on October 24th. He immediately flew back to North Africa, arriving on October 25th to find his defensive line under tremendous pressure and his understanding of British dispositions completely inverted. The forces he'd expected in the south were in the north. The airfields his Luftwaffe had been bombing didn't exist. The supply concentrations intelligence had identified were theatrical props. The entire intelligence picture had been fiction. What Rommel said in those first days, as the scope of the deception became clear, was not recorded in any single dramatic pronouncement. His papers and those of his staff paint instead a picture of growing comprehension and professional dismay. Intelligence assessments were hastily revised. Reconnaissance sorties were redirected to verify what was real versus what had been illusion. The discovery that dummy installations had consumed so much ordnance, bombs that might have interdicted actual British supply lines or struck real forward positions, represented a force multiplication for Montgomery that went beyond the tanks and guns he'd accumulated. In tactical discussions with his staff, Rommel's language grew bitter about intelligence failures. He'd trusted the reconnaissance reports, the photo interpretations, the agent network assessments. All had been systematically compromised or deceived. The General Field Marshal understood military deception. He'd employed it himself, using dummy tanks and false radio traffic in earlier campaigns. But the scale and sophistication of Bertram exceeded anything he'd encountered. It suggested an enemy who understood not just tactics but psychology, who could manipulate perception at the strategic level. German after-action analyses, compiled in subsequent weeks as the Panzer Army Africa retreated westward, attempted to understand how the deception had succeeded so completely. Photo interpreters re-examined archived reconnaissance negatives, looking for clues they'd missed. What they found was chastening. The dummy installations had been nearly perfect replicas at the altitude and angles from which German cameras operated. Distinguishing them from genuine facilities would have required close examination of details that wartime priorities and resource constraints had precluded. The realization that British camouflage capabilities had achieved this level of sophistication forced German intelligence to question everything. If dummy aircraft could fool trained interpreters, what else might be fake? If an entire false order of battle could be created and sustained for weeks, how could any intelligence assessment be trusted? This erosion of confidence in intelligence became, in its own way, another British victory. German commanders would approach subsequent assessments with paralyzing skepticism, never certain what was real. For the Luftwaffe crews who'd flown those missions against dummy targets, the revelation was particularly galling. They'd risked anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, and RAF interceptors. They'd seen their bombs strike home, observed explosions and fires, reported successful destruction of enemy capabilities. All of it had been theater. The personal courage and professional skill they'd demonstrated had been wasted attacking props on an empty stage. The psychological impact of that realization, that their sacrifices had been manipulated into futility, corroded morale in ways no amount of combat losses could match. Rommel's own comments in letters to his wife Lucy, written during the retreat from El Alamein, reflected a man reassessing his understanding of the enemy. The British, he'd long believed, were materially superior, but tactically conventional. They would leverage resources through straightforward application of mass and firepower. Bertram demonstrated something more concerning: strategic imagination combined with industrial capacity. They could not only build more tanks and aircraft, but also create sophisticated deceptions that multiplied their advantage. The General Field Marshal's faith in German operational superiority, the belief that better training, doctrine, and leadership could offset material inferiority, received a profound blow. The British hadn't simply outproduced Germany, though they had. They'd outthought German intelligence at every level. The dummy installations weren't crude attempts at misdirection, but carefully engineered illusions supported by comprehensive operational security. This suggested an enemy who could think systematically about warfare, who understood the integration of intelligence, deception, and operational planning. What made the deception's revelation particularly painful was its exposure of German intelligence methodology's fundamental weaknesses. The system had been optimized for a certain kind of war, mobile operations, where tactical intelligence about immediate enemy positions mattered more than strategic assessment. Reconnaissance pilots were superb at identifying tank concentrations or supply columns. Photo interpreters excelled at tactical analysis. But the system lacked safeguards against systematic deception, lacked the skepticism to question convergent evidence from multiple compromised sources. The British had exploited every seam in that system. They'd understood that German intelligence operated under resource constraints, limited reconnaissance sorties, overworked interpreters, pressure for actionable assessments. They'd crafted their deception to exploit those constraints, providing just enough detail to convince harried analysts while avoiding the intensive scrutiny that might reveal fakery. They'd created a narrative that aligned with German expectations and doctrine, making it psychologically credible even when physical evidence might have warranted deeper skepticism. Rommel's papers from the post-Alamein period show a man grappling with implications that extended beyond the immediate battle. If British deception capabilities were this sophisticated, what else had he missed? Were his assessments of British strength and dispositions elsewhere in theater equally compromised? The questions had no comfortable answers. The intelligence system he'd relied upon had been revealed as fundamentally vulnerable to the kind of systematic deception Operation Bertram represented. The wooden bombers that had absorbed so many tons of Luftwaffe ordnance represented more than tactical misdirection. They embodied a fundamental difference in how the two sides approached the industrial dimension of modern war. For Germany, resources were finite and precious. Every bomb had to count. Every sortie required justification against competing demands. The Luftwaffe operated under constant scarcity, forced to prioritize ruthlessly, to calculate maximum effect from minimum expenditure. This efficiency-minded approach made them paradoxically more vulnerable to deception that exploited their desperation for high-value targets. The British, by contrast, could afford to be wasteful in pursuit of strategic advantage. The resources devoted to Operation Bertram, the labor hours, the materials, the skilled personnel diverted from other tasks, would have seemed profligate to German planners accustomed to making do with less. Hundreds of dummy tanks, each requiring days of construction. Entire false airfields, complete with dummy aircraft, support vehicles, and infrastructure. Thousands of man-hours maintaining the illusion, moving pieces around like stage sets to create the appearance of activity. To German eyes, it seemed almost decadent, using so many resources merely to deceive rather than to destroy. But that apparent waste was itself a form of power projection. The British could build both the real army and the phantom one. They could construct actual aircraft and also the plywood replicas that would draw Luftwaffe attacks. This dual
capacity, genuine force, and elaborate deception operating simultaneously demonstrated industrial depth that Germany simply couldn't match. Rommel understood this on a visceral level as El Alamein unfolded. He wasn't just fighting Montgomery's tanks and artillery. He was fighting an economic system that could afford to wage war on multiple levels simultaneously. The dummy aircraft remained in place even after the deception was revealed, scattered across forward airfields like abandoned props after a performance. British forces, advancing westward, had no reason to destroy or remove them. They'd served their purpose. German troops retreating through these positions in late October and November 1942 could examine up close the objects that had consumed so much ordnance. The construction was simultaneously crude and sophisticated. Up close, the plywood frames and canvas coverings were obviously fake. But from reconnaissance altitude, photographed through cameras, optimized for different purposes, they'd been indistinguishable from genuine aircraft. Luftwaffe personnel who'd flown missions against these targets experienced a particular species of humiliation when they saw the wreckage. Here was a dummy bomber, its wooden frame splintered by a direct hit, canvas torn by shrapnel, the whole assemblage reduced to kindling, exactly as a real aircraft would appear after a successful attack. The bomb craters around these positions matched mission reports precisely. Everything had worked as planned, except for one catastrophic detail. The targets hadn't been real. The professional pride of having executed successful strikes dissolved into the bitter recognition of having been manipulated. German intelligence officers conducting post-battle analysis photographed the dummy installations extensively, documenting the construction techniques and placement strategies. These photographs would circulate through Luftwaffe intelligence channels, serving as cautionary examples of British deception capabilities. Training materials would be revised to include warning signs of dummy installations. Photo interpreters would be instructed to examine reconnaissance negatives with greater skepticism, to look for telltale indicators of fakery. But the damage to confidence couldn't be repaired through procedural adjustments. The psychological wound, the knowledge that everything you see might be illusion, proved more persistent than any tactical lessons. The scope of wasted resources extended beyond the obvious expenditure of bombs and aviation fuel. Each mission against dummy targets had consumed pilot hours that could never be recovered. Experienced aviators, irreplaceable in a theater where pilot attrition exceeded training capacity, had risked their lives attacking empty airfields. Aircraft maintenance hours, equally precious, had been devoted to preparing planes for strikes against non-existent threats. Intelligence analysts had spent countless hours examining photographs of installations that existed only to be photographed. The cumulative waste represented strategic defeat before the ground battle even began. Rommel's correspondence with Berlin in the weeks following El Alamein reflected growing frustration with the intelligence support he was receiving. The General Field Marshal's requests for better reconnaissance, for more sophisticated photo interpretation,
For improved signals intelligence collided with Oberkommando der Wehrmacht's limited capacity to provide these resources. Germany's intelligence services were stretched across multiple theaters, from the Eastern Front to the Atlantic Wall, from the Mediterranean to Scandinavia. The sophisticated counter-deception capabilities Rommel needed didn't exist and couldn't be improvised. The British, meanwhile, were refining their deception techniques based on Bertram's success. The lessons learned about German reconnaissance patterns, about photo interpretation vulnerabilities, about the effectiveness of convergent deception across multiple intelligence channels would inform subsequent operations. Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign supporting D-Day in Normandy, would employ similar principles on an even grander scale. Dummy tanks and aircraft would appear in southeast England, suggesting an invasion at Pas de Calais, while actual forces massed for Normandy. The methodology proven in the desert would be applied to the invasion of Europe. For the German military intelligence apparatus, Operation Bertram represented a systemic failure that exposed deep structural problems. The Abwehr and Luftwaffe intelligence had been outplayed not through superior German capabilities being overcome, but through German assumptions being exploited. British intelligence officers had understood how their adversaries thought, what they expected to see, how they processed information. They'd crafted their deception to fit within German cognitive frameworks, making the false evidence psychologically compelling, even when physical evidence was ambiguous. The revelation forced German intelligence to confront uncomfortable truths about their own methodology. Reconnaissance photography, treated as objective evidence, was actually interpretation, analysts seeing patterns and making judgments based on expectations and doctrine. Those expectations could be manipulated. Signals intelligence, seemingly harder to deceive, could be flooded with false traffic or used to reinforce photographic deception. Human intelligence, always suspect, became nearly worthless once British counterintelligence had identified and turned key agents. The convergence of evidence from multiple sources, once considered the gold standard for confirming intelligence assessments, proved vulnerable when all sources were simultaneously compromised. Rommel's personal assessment of what had happened evolved over the months following El Alamein. Initial anger at specific intelligence. Failures gave way to broader recognition that the British had demonstrated capabilities Germany couldn't match. In conversations with staff officers, recorded in various war diaries and memoirs, the General Field Marshal acknowledged that Operation Bertram revealed an adversary who thought systematically about every dimension of warfare, not just tactics and operations, but intelligence, deception, and psychological manipulation. The dummy bombers became symbolic of this broader capability gap. They were such simple objects: plywood, canvas, paint. Any competent carpenter could build one. But the system that deployed them effectively, the reconnaissance of German reconnaissance patterns, the analysis of photo interpretation techniques, the coordination of deception across dozens of false installations, the operational security that prevented leaks, the integration with actual combat operations. That system represented sophistication that Germany couldn't replicate, even if it understood the principles. British officers who'd planned and executed Bertram were, by late 1942, already applying lessons learned to new theaters. Major Barkas and his camouflage teams were being consulted for operations in Italy and northwestern Europe. The techniques developed for desert conditions, where lack of vegetation and clear atmospherics made concealment difficult, were being adapted for European terrain. Dummy landing craft would appear in British ports, suggesting invasion preparations at false locations. Inflatable tanks, lighter and faster to deploy than wooden frames, would create phantom armored divisions. The industrial capacity that made such extensive deception possible rested ultimately on resources Germany lacked. Britain could devote factories to producing dummy equipment because other factories were producing real equipment in sufficient quantities, Workers could be assigned to construction and maintenance of false installations because enough workers existed to handle actual military production. The strategic depth that allowed this dual investment in both reality and illusion, itself derived from imperial resources, American material support, and an intact industrial base protected by the English Channel from ground attack. Rommel recognized this disparity with the clarity of a commander watching his options narrow. The Panzer Army Africa's retreat from El Alamein became a race against logistics collapse. Every mile westward stretched supply lines that were already overstrained. Every tank lost, every aircraft destroyed represented irreplaceable capacity. The British, pushing after him, could afford losses that would cripple German operations. They had reserves behind their reserves, replacement equipment flowing from factories Rommel couldn't reach, fresh units rotating forward to replace exhausted ones. The psychological dimension of discovering the deception's scope affected German forces beyond Rommel's immediate command. News of the dummy installations spread through the Afrika Korps and its Italian allies. Soldiers who'd endured British air attacks, who'd seen comrades killed by RAF bombers and fighters, learned that the Luftwaffe had wasted precious sorties bombing plywood. The revelation corroded confidence in headquarters, in intelligence, in the competence of senior command. If the generals could be so completely deceived about something as fundamental as enemy dispositions, what else were they wrong about? This erosion of trust between frontline troops and higher command became another British victory, harder to quantify than tanks destroyed or ground captured, but equally significant. Armies function on confidence. Soldiers must believe their commanders understand the battlefield, that orders reflect accurate assessment of the situation, that sacrifices serve genuine strategic purpose. Operation Bertram damaged that confidence by revealing that German command had operated for weeks under fundamental misapprehensions about enemy strength and positions. Italian forces fighting alongside Rommel's Germans experienced the deception's revelation differently, but no less painfully. Italy's contribution to the North African campaign had always been constrained by industrial limitations more severe than Germany's. Italian aircraft, tanks, and artillery were generally inferior to British equivalents and dramatically outmatched by American equipment beginning to appear in theater. The discovery that even Germany's vaunted intelligence capabilities, supposedly superior to anyone's, could be so completely fooled suggested that Axis forces were fighting an enemy who exceeded them in every dimension, material, technical, and intellectual. The specific details of how Operation Bertram had been executed emerged gradually through interrogation of captured British personnel, through examination of installations as Axis forces retreated westward, through German intelligence's painstaking reconstruction of what they'd missed. Each detail illuminated another aspect of British thoroughness. The dummy aircraft hadn't simply been placed randomly, but positioned according to actual RAF doctrine for dispersal and protection. The false supply dumps showed realistic accumulation patterns, starting small, growing over weeks, exactly as genuine dumps would develop. The sunshield system that had disguised real tanks as trucks proved particularly ingenious upon examination. The lightweight frames could be erected quickly, transforming an armored regiment into what appeared to be a transport column. During daylight hours, German reconnaissance would photograph what seemed to be supply vehicles in rear areas. At night, those same tanks would move forward into attack positions, their movements hidden by darkness and desert terrain. By dawn, they'd be in place, still disguised, while dummy tanks appeared in the positions they'd vacated. The continuous cycle of real equipment moving forward.
While dummy equipment appeared to remain static, created an intelligence picture inverted from reality. Rommel's assessment of Montgomery's generalship shifted in light of Bertram's revelation. The 8th Army commander had been dismissed by some German officers as cautious, methodical, unimaginative, a general who would win through material superiority rather than tactical brilliance. But Bertram demonstrated imagination of a different sort. The strategic patience to prepare an elaborate deception over months, the systematic thinking to coordinate across dozens of units and installations, the psychological insight to exploit German cognitive biases and operational assumptions. This wasn't the conventional plotting the Germans had expected, but something more dangerous, methodical preparation in service of sophisticated deception. The dummy installations remained scattered across the western desert for years after the war, gradually disintegrating under sun and sand. Post-war historians and journalists would photograph the remnants: skeletal wooden frames, rotted canvas, rusted oil drums, and marvel at their effectiveness. The visual evidence of how crude the deception had been up close made its success from reconnaissance altitude all the more impressive. German photo interpreters hadn't been incompetent. They'd been looking at images optimized for tactical intelligence, not forensic examination, and seeing what trained observers would reasonably expect to see. Luftwaffe veterans, writing memoirs decades later, still expressed bewilderment and frustration about the dummy targets. The raids had been planned competently, executed professionally, and reported accurately, except that the fundamental premise that the targets were real had been false. No amount of tactical excellence could overcome strategic misdirection at that scale. The experience taught painful lessons about the limits of air power when intelligence supporting target selection had been comprehensively compromised. For Rommel personally, Operation Bertram marked a turning point in his understanding of the war's trajectory. He'd fought brilliantly with limited resources for 18 months, achieving tactical victories through superior doctrine and leadership. But Bertram revealed an enemy who'd learned to negate those advantages through systematic deception backed by industrial capacity. The wooden bombers weren't just tactical props. They were symbols of British strategic depth. An enemy who could afford to build elaborate fakes while simultaneously building overwhelming real forces was an enemy who couldn't be defeated through tactical excellence alone. The General Field Marshal's famous optimism, his belief that audacity and operational skill could overcome material disadvantage, began eroding after El Alamein. In staff conferences during the long retreat westward, Rommel's language grew darker, more fatalistic. He spoke of fighting delays rather than winning victories, of preserving force rather than seeking decisive engagement. The revelation that he'd been comprehensively deceived about British dispositions contributed to this shift. If intelligence couldn't be trusted, if reconnaissance revealed only what the enemy wanted revealed, then operational planning became guesswork. The wooden bombers at those false airfields had absorbed, by German estimates compiled after the battle, approximately 250 tons of ordnance over 6 weeks of intermittent attacks. Each ton represented bombs that might have struck actual British positions, supply lines, or troop concentrations. The cumulative effect of that misdirected firepower exceeded the impact of any single tactical engagement. Montgomery had effectively eliminated German air interdiction against his actual buildup without fighting for air superiority in the conventional sense. He'd simply redirected enemy attacks against targets that didn't matter. This force multiplication through deception represented a form of warfare that German doctrine had underestimated. The Wehrmacht understood operational deception, maskirovka, as the Soviets called it, the art of concealment and misdirection at tactical scales. But Operation Bertram operated at a different level entirely. It was strategic deception sustained over months, coordinating dozens of false installations, integrating photographic signals and human intelligence deception, all supporting a single operational objective: to conceal the point of main effort until too late for effective German response.
The British Commonwealth forces that advanced westward from El Alamein in November and December 1942 encountered German and Italian positions that had been prepared to defend against attacks from different directions. Rommel's deployment of reserves, his positioning of artillery, his allocation of the limited air support available, all reflected intelligence assessments that Bertram had rendered obsolete. Units were out of position. Supplies were accumulated in wrong locations. Defensive preparations emphasized sectors where no major attack came, while the actual breakthrough encountered lighter resistance than British planners had anticipated. This displacement of German defensive effort represented perhaps Bertram's most significant achievement. The British hadn't just deceived reconnaissance. They'd manipulated German operational decision-making. Rommel and his staff had made reasonable choices based on the intelligence available to them. Those choices proved catastrophically wrong, not because of errors in logic, but because the evidence upon which they reasoned had been systematically falsified. No amount of tactical competence could compensate for strategic decisions based on fictional premises. The lessons German intelligence drew from Operation Bertram's revelation would shape Wehrmacht approach to Allied deceptions throughout the remainder of the war. Skepticism toward
reconnaissance photography increased. Photo interpreters were instructed to look for indicators of dummy installations. Intelligence assessments began, including caveats about possible deception. But these adjustments, while sensible, couldn't solve the fundamental problem. In a war against enemies with overwhelming industrial capacity, distinguishing real build-ups from fake ones became nearly impossible. The British and Americans could afford to create both, leaving German intelligence paralyzed by uncertainty. Rommel's final assessment of what the wooden bombers represented came in letters written during his eventual reassignment from North Africa to Europe. He described Operation Bertram as an intelligence failure, but also as evidence of British strategic maturity. They'd understood that in modern industrialized warfare, deception could be as decisive as firepower. They'd invested resources accordingly, treating the dummy installations not as afterthoughts but as integral components of operational planning. This level of integration between intelligence, deception, and operations exceeded German capabilities not because of inferior personnel but because of systemic differences in how the two sides conceptualized warfare. The General Field Marshal had begun the North African campaign confident that German operational excellence could offset British material advantages. He ended it understanding that material advantages, properly leveraged through sophisticated deception and operational integration, couldn't be overcome through tactical skill alone. The wooden bombers that had wasted Luftwaffe ordnance embodied this reality. They were crude objects individually, but devastating components of a comprehensive system that outthought German intelligence at every level. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.